Hello, this is Mark Roithmayr, CEO of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, with my partner in crime, Howard Fillit, our co-founder and chief science officer of the ADDF. Thank you all for joining us today. And hard to believe it's December. We're wrapping up the year already. And 2023, what an incredible year it's been for Alzheimer's research. Howard, have you ever seen anything like this in your lifetime?
No, Mark, when I started in the field over 40 years ago, we knew nothing about the disease and there was really no drugs on the market. And, science has just been building these last 45 years or so. And I've never seen a year like this. It's been so exciting with the drug approval and all the new diagnostics we have. It's really quite amazing.
Truly amazing. This is in our lifetime. Howard, how brilliant for you, but
What?
quite frankly, for all of the scientists
Oh,
who've
I turned it off as fast as I can.
dedicated their careers to studying this disease to see the work that's beginning to pay off.
Yeah, I mean, beta amyloid, the main target that's been targeted for about 40 years, was only discovered in 1984, which was about 40 years ago. So it's literally taken us 40 years to get where we are today, but now we have the first effective therapeutics on the market and more to come, and diagnostic tests. I can order a blood test for somebody with Alzheimer's disease now. It's just incredible, the change, just amazing. And there's many other drugs in development now.
Yeah, and Howard, I think this is, we often talk about how quickly things have moved in the last year or two or three, but I think it's just as important, or maybe more important than ever, that we're going to keep our foot on the gas moving forward here.
Yeah, the drug that's been approved slows it down about 30% or so over 18 months, which is, interesting and significant. A lot of those people were stabilized. So I think the drugs in terms of safety and benefit are worth taking, but we want to get to 100% slowing if we can, or even finding drugs that can reverse the disease and improve patients' symptoms. And I think we're going to get there. And that's going to be the next step. 75% of the drugs in development now are non-amyloid novel drugs targeting processes like inflammation in the brain and what we call misfolded proteins and epigenetics and so on, some technical terms out there. But it used to be 5, 6, 7 years ago that the main focus of the drugs was on amyloid, and now it's completely reversed.
It's fascinating. We have these standard of care now that's getting us up to 35% effective, but we know we're not going to stop till we get to the 100. So, Howard, as you look forward to 2024, what are some of the breakthroughs on the horizon that you and, quite frankly, we all at the ADDF are most excited about?
Well, I think the next big event is going to be the approval of Lilly's monoclonal antibody to beta amyloid, hopefully in the first quarter of 2024. And that medication is still an infusion product, but it has some advantages in that it's once a month, and it might be able to be stopped after 18 months or so, 12 to 18 months. Once the amyloid's been cleared from the brain as measured by the PET scan or possibly by a blood test. But I think the other thing that's really exciting on the horizon is that these infusion products are a little bit of difficulty in taking. You have to sit in an infusion center and get an intravenous infusion. It takes about an hour and a half. But the next phase of those drugs will be subcutaneous injection, where people will get sort of like EpiPens, maybe a little bit bigger than that, and they'll be able to inject themselves at home.
Wow.
And that's going to reduce the cost and the burden of taking these drugs remarkably and enable people to get them at home. And I think it may turn out that these subcutaneous injectors will be approved for Alzheimer's disease in 2024, maybe 2025, but they're coming. And I think that's going to be the next new thing for the treatment of Alzheimer's.
Yeah. And Howard, before we leave this area, let's just drill down a little bit on Lilly's drug donanemab and what makes its upcoming approval so exciting.
Well, it's, every drug has different chemistry, and the Lilly drug has a different chemistry, I'll just leave it at that, than the Eisai drug. And there's a little bit of evidence that it might be more efficacious, and it's only once a month. Whether that's going to be a big deal breaker for some people or not, I'm not sure. But we will have competing drugs on the market, and there are other ones that are anti-amyloid drugs that are also being developed. So I think we're going to have a pretty robust marketplace for these anti-amyloid drugs. And I think the Lilly drug will be the next step forward in 2024. And it's exciting about them because of the way they did the clinical trials and enrolling people with early disease as measured by tau imaging, which was really exciting. Their stopping rules and the once a month administration.
Yeah. And so, Howard, we talk about the drugs, and that's kind of one half of the equation about how do we get to market here. The other part of the equation are the diagnostic tools. Can we identify early and accurately? And just 2 months ago, CMS came out and expanded their coverage of the amyloid PET scan. And Howard, can you give us a sense of why that's so important, and particularly now?
The PET scan was approved by the FDA in 2012. And CMS basically denied coverage around 2014, something like that. And so the use of the PET scan in general practice has been extremely limited. I've used it in my practice because it's a private pay and my patients have been able to use it. And I've found it to be tremendously helpful because very often people come in with early memory loss or problems in thinking, and it's hard to know really exactly what they have. What is the future going to look like? What kind of drugs should we put them on? And in my experience, I've been able to send them over to the local radiology office down the street. The next day, they get the PET amyloid scan. And within 24 hours, they get the report from the radiologist whether or not they have Alzheimer's disease. This makes a huge difference in the way I care for these patients. And especially now that these treatments that are anti-amyloid treatments are on the market, to be eligible to get them, they're going to have a positive brain scan. So we've been fighting for Medicare to pay for these brain scans for a long time, at least 10 years. And it's very gratifying to see that this scan, which has been termed revolutionary by the neurology community itself, but grossly underutilized across the country, will now be available to all Medicare beneficiaries. So everyone will have the opportunity to get a brain scan to find out if they actually have Alzheimer's. And it rolls into prevention because what the brain scan has done is enabled us to learn that this disease starts maybe 20 years before there are symptoms, which gives us a really big window for preventing the progression of the disease before it becomes symptomatic. And it's been estimated that if we could delay the onset of symptoms from Alzheimer's by just 5 years, we would reduce the number of symptomatic cases by 50%. The current precision prevention efforts that are going on around the world, including the finger trial that we're partnering with, I think that 50% reduction in the number of symptomatic cases is achievable.
Wow. All right. So we talked about treatments. I want to talk a little bit more about the diagnostic front, and then we'll, after that, get into the prevention. We know it's a wide array of biomarkers and diagnostic tools that are going to need to complement this arsenal of drugs that are coming forward. And Howard, at the ADDF, we have what's called the Diagnostics Accelerator. This is a partnership that we did with donations from Leonard Lauder and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Scott and the Dolby family. And it's a long list of wonderful donors. It's $100 million that we're deploying over a 6-year period, but really, that program is about 3 things, right? Can we get blood? Can we get optical? Can we get digital biomarkers and diagnostics in? So can you give us a little sense, where is that program now and what are you most excited about it coming out of the Diagnostic Accelerator?
So we have 3 pillars in the Diagnostic Accelerator: blood, what we call digital, and retinal. Those are the main focus of the Diagnostic Accelerator. So what does retinal mean? Well, the back of the eye, the retina, is the window to the brain. And it's been discovered that there are amyloid deposits in people with Alzheimer's disease in the retina. So there's new technology, fancy word, hyperspectral imaging, that's actually currently being used in ophthalmology offices for other purposes. And it's been adapted to detect the amyloid in the back of the eye. So imagine a world where every year when older people or middle-aged people go for their annual eye checkup, they could get this test. It maybe takes 10, 15 minutes. It costs $100. And they could find out if they're cooking Alzheimer's or if they have it, if they have a little bit of memory loss. And then the referrals would go to the neurologist for follow-up care and all that. So that's one way that we would enhance the early diagnosis through these retinal efforts and some of the companies that we're funding to do that. The second pillar is the digital. What that means is that going forward, we imagine a world where you might be able to pick up whether you have early Alzheimer's on your phone, on your cell phone, for example. And one way to do that would be to capture your speech and see if your speech is starting to be abnormal in terms of vocabulary, grammar, language, tone, and so on. There's many aspects to speech. Speech is clearly the expression of thought, cognition in your mind. So we've established the largest program that I know of looking at gathering data on speech in people with early Alzheimer's disease. And that database is going to be, excuse me. That database.
Take your time, buddy. We're good.
That database is going to be available around the world for people to analyze and use and create products so that there will be a day, let's say you're talking to your doctor on the phone, or you're joining a managed care organization as a Medicare Advantage member, and people want to find out, whether you have early indications based on your speech of a cognitive impairment. This will greatly facilitate early, again, what we're moving towards is getting early and reliable diagnosis. And speech is just one example of the many ways that, for example, we're already using your Apple Watch to detect whether you're having an arrhythmia. That's one example of digital applications to heart disease. It's going to be very similar in early Alzheimer's. And then the third big one are the blood tests. I already mentioned one of the blood tests that's available almost all throughout the country now from a company called C2N that we've invested in. But there are also other tests for blood tests that are fairly reliable for early diagnosis of Alzheimer's that's being on the market now by Quest and LabCorp and several other companies that are developing these tests, and they're getting better and better. So we're going to have really reliable blood tests that doctors will be able to use as part of the mainstream of their practice. You come into the office with a memory problem, and probably eventually what will happen is instead of having to go for that brain scan down the block, they'll just be able to order a blood test and find out whether you have early Alzheimer's, and then hopefully enter into some treatment protocols or clinical trials to slow it down or reverse it.
Yeah, how exciting, right, Howard? And
It's amazing.
we go back 5-10 years ago, and these were dreams, right? And here we are. All right. The other topic that you brought up that we want to talk a little bit about is the topic of partnerships and initiatives around precision prevention, because at the beginning of this year, we started hearing these words, and I've watched you jump on this area of inquiry. So, Howard, next frontier of Alzheimer's, precision prevention. What do you got to say about it?
It's really exciting the way the field has evolved. And as you said, Mark, this is being talked about everywhere now, precision prevention. And I think there's going to be a lot of worldwide efforts. The group we're working with that came out of Scandinavia, Mia Kivipelto's work, really showed that there were 5 pillars of prevention, even though there are probably 10 or maybe even 15 or 20 risk factors that come out of what we call epidemiological studies. But what Mia did was identify 5 big ones: diabetes, hypertension, lack of exercise, sedentary lifestyle, proper diet, social engagement, cognitive stimulation, relief stress, and so on. And she showed in a randomized clinical trial that these, through implementation science, that if people were compliant with their prevention approaches like exercising and so on, and managing diabetes and hypertension really carefully, that you could slow down cognitive impairment with aging and even slow down the process of Alzheimer's. And her work was so interesting that it's being replicated in over 60 countries around the world. So that showed that prevention can work. But the next phase is what you mentioned, Mark, which is precision prevention, which means finding out what each person's risk factors are and then tailoring the prevention program to their risk factors. So, for example, one of the leading risk factors, surprisingly enough, is hearing loss. And maybe that has something to do with how active your brain is when you can't hear things. We don't know the mechanism, but hearing loss is clearly one of the main risk factors for dementia and cognitive decline in old age. So getting somebody to get good hearing aids and using them is a form of precision prevention. Getting someone who's a diabetic to get tight control, not just to manage their glucose, but to protect their brain from the diabetes as a risk factor for cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, getting them to manage their hypertension, getting them to have a proper diet, getting people to exercise by finding out where their deficits are and precisely attacking those areas of prevention where people need help is what I think precision prevention is. And the last part of it is adding drugs to the lifestyle and comorbidity management. So we're funding a study of the leading anti-aging drug, which is metformin, to add on to all these other risk factor lifestyle things to slow it down. And it's much like heart disease. We recommend very similar risk factor management for heart disease, like exercise, but then we add a statin to the regimen prevention. And it's, the prevention of Alzheimer's is moving in the same direction, and it's a really exciting time.
Howard, it's fascinating, right? New drugs breaking through, diagnostics that are ultimately going to be, going for your eye exam and digital, prevention, but precision prevention that's geared to each one of us individually. Truly unprecedented progress this past year.
It's amazing. I mean, like I said in the beginning, Mark, I've been doing this over 40 years. And, I've seen it grow from nothing and all the data, tens of thousands of papers in the literature, thousands of scientists working on this for 35, 40 years intensely. And it's paying off. It's paying off. And I think where we used to live in a world where Alzheimer's was like unapproachable by industry, pharma, biotechs, academics, now it's a world where we've made progress and we've proven the principle that Alzheimer's can be managed, it can be treated, it can be prevented, it can be diagnosed. It's a completely different world, both in research and in clinical practice.
Yeah, and Howard, let me just sing your praises for a second. You and along with your co-founders, Leonard and Ronald Lauder, 25 years ago, you went out after this through a biology of aging approach. You've said for as long as I've known you that this is going to be prevention, biomarkers, combined therapies, precision medicine. And we would hear that in the office and we could all recite it, but now it's happening. And so, hats off to ADDF in that. Hats off to you, Howard, that you've been driving these research and resources. And clearly, what's great about you and the scientific team here, we're not stopping until it's 35% is okay, but we got to get to the 100%. All right, for all the folks that are on with us today, we have a wide array of people that are on, and it's everything from we have scientists on and donors on and biotechs on and VCs on. So it's a great wide array of the audience. We're opening this up to the Q&A, and I think as you can see, participating in this webinar today, you can put your questions in the queue, and we will get to them. Howard, there's a first question here I want to make sure I start with, and then we'll queue through others. First question. This is a great question because you hadn't touched on it yet. Why is senolytics a promising area of research, and what senolytics trials are the ADDF funding? And perhaps, Howard, you want to start first for those who may not understand it. What the heck are senolytics, right?
Well, let me start with the biology of aging. When we talk about risk factors, and I spoke about that for precision prevention, but it turns out that by far the leading risk factor for Alzheimer's, like other chronic diseases of old age, is aging. And that's why we talk so much about the biology of aging. So what's unique about the biology of aging is that as we age, we accumulate what are called senescent cells. And these are cells that they've been alternatively described as zombie cells, which means that they are impaired, they're dysfunctional, they cause inflammation, and they refuse to die. And so they're hanging out in all our organs, and they contribute to what we call our aging phenotype, the way we look and feel, why we have heart disease and lung disease and kidney disease and skin disease and Alzheimer's disease with aging is because these zombie cells accumulate in all of our organs. And we've known about this for a while, but we've never really had ways of attacking these zombie cells and trying to kill them, to make them go away so that it would reduce the amount of local inflammation and other forms of injury that these senescent cells cause. And we're funding one of the leaders in this field, Miranda Orr at Wake Forest University, to do a combination study of two drugs, It's a repurposing study of a drug called dasatinib, which is actually originally a cancer drug, but it's been shown to kill the senescent zombie cells, and a supplement called quercetin, which is what's called an epigenetic drug that also helps to kill these. And in combination, they're being studied in a clinical trial for Alzheimer's disease. So it's kind of a repurposing two drugs, one from cancer, one from the field of genetics and other pathways, to kill these zombie senescent cells and reduce the amount of inflammation that they cause as a treatment for Alzheimer's. And I think it's just really the very, very first example of a unique approach to the biology of aging being applied to the treatment, the development of new treatments for Alzheimer's disease.
Which is terrific. And you mentioned Miranda Orr. She is one of the ADDF's Goods Prize winners, and that annually recognizes the top clinical trial scientists that are out there. So amazing work she's doing at Wake Forest. All right, next question up. You mentioned Mia Kivipelto's study. Can you speak to the connection between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's, and why is metformin as an aging drug promising?
Yeah, with aging, all of us basically develop some degree of insulin resistance. And all of our cells, the reason that's a problem is because one of the major, if not the major form of energy for our cells, and especially in the brain, is glucose. If you think about a diabetic, once they become hypoglycemic, let's say they take too much insulin or they forget to eat a meal and they're on insulin, one of the first things that happens to a diabetic when they in that state where they've had too much insulin is they go unconscious. They immediately go unconscious. And if we give them a little bit of orange juice or somehow inject them with glucose, they perk up immediately. That's the acute response to a lack of glucose in the brain. Imagine that kind of lack of glucose chronically in older people. And there are many ways that these pathways, I won't get into it, but there's many ways that this biology is bad and can cause neurodegeneration. So one of the main approaches in terms of addressing the biology of aging is to try to improve insulin resistance. And that's essentially what metformin does. It improves insulin resistance throughout the brain. I would say about, I don't know, it must be 6-7 years ago, we funded a clinical trial up at Columbia of metformin for Alzheimer's disease, people with MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And the outcome was primarily imaging, and it was a very interesting study. We spent a couple of $1 million on it, and that investigator just got tens of millions of dollars to do a very large trial of metformin for the treatment of Alzheimer's. Again, the mechanism is a little bit more complicated than just insulin resistance, but that's the major focus. I think the other interesting thing that people should know about is that we all love Ozempic. Semaglutide is the generic name for the famous drug that everybody wants to take for obesity and so on. But one of the main mechanisms that Ozempic or semaglutide works by is to improve insulin resistance, and it's very effective. And Novo Nordisk, who is the manufacturer of semaglutide, is now conducting a clinical trial, enrolling over 3,000 people to see if Ozempic, semaglutide, actually it's the oral form of the drug Rybelsus, can work to treat Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is fascinating because what we're seeing now is the definition of an anti-aging drug. So I think it's really fascinating because it turns out that semaglutide is good for diabetes, as expected, heart disease, kidney disease, and now maybe dementia. And that would be the definition of an anti-aging drug because it would be treating all of these illnesses at the same time.
Fascinating, Howard. So, lose weight and get cognition clarity. Hey, sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. We got a ton of questions in here, so I'm just going to keep plowing through, which is great. Okay. There are new blood tests on the market. Are there any limitations to these new tests? And how can these blood tests be used to determine if and when you should take new drugs on the market?
So the blood tests are being developed in reference to the gold standard, which is the imaging.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that some of the blood tests are actually better than the imaging in detecting very early disease, which is kind of interesting. So I think we know at this point in time that the blood tests are reliable in predicting whether someone has amyloid, for example, or tau in the brain as a sign of Alzheimer's disease. So that validates the test, particularly something called p-tau217, as a way of seeing if someone has Alzheimer's disease in the brain. It's validated. I think the way the test will be used is, as I mentioned, somebody comes in as like any other test, they have clinical symptoms, and then the doctor goes to a blood test to try to define whether the patient has the disease. It fits right into the work stream of a typical clinician's practice.
Yeah.
And I think it does, we don't have this validated yet, but I think it is possible through clinical practice guidelines that what will happen is that the blood test, hopefully, and my hope is that it will replace the need for a brain scan, because the correlation between the blood test and the brain scan is so high, and it'll enable people to get these new drugs just on the basis of the blood test. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of widespread agreement, but that's the direction we're going in.
You know, and interesting, Howard, I think we do see a day in front of us that you'll go for the blood test, and that will serve as the standard unless you have a particularly complicated case, and then you would get the brain scan on top of that. All right. Here's a question, moves us over to the world of genetics. What role does genetics and, of course, the ApoE4 gene play in the onset of Alzheimer's? And is the ADDF funding any gene therapy programs?
So, we all get a gene from our mom and a gene from our dad. And for ApoE, for example, there are three forms of ApoE: ApoE2, ApoE3, ApoE4. 70% of people have ApoE3, about 5% of people have ApoE2, and about 20% or so people have ApoE4, either one or two ApoE4s. If you have an ApoE2, you're actually protected somewhat against Alzheimer's. And if you have an ApoE4, if you have just one, you're about 3 to 5 times greater risk. And if you have two, if you're a double E4, you're maybe 10 to 15 times greater risk. So I said about 20% of people are what we call carriers of ApoE4, but 60% of people that have symptomatic Alzheimer's disease have ApoE4. So we've known about this about 35 years now, that ApoE4 is a dramatic risk factor, genetic risk factor for getting Alzheimer's. If you're a double 4, you get it at a greater risk, and you're going to probably get it 10 or 15 years earlier than the average person in terms of symptoms. We haven't been able to figure out how to drug it, how to fix it. We've invested in a company that was spun out of Cornell about 5 years ago called Lexeo, that is going to doing gene therapy for Alzheimer's, and it's trying to through the injection into the brain of a non-infectious virus that carries the gene for the protective variant of ApoE called ApoE2, and use that to offset the bad parts of ApoE4. They're already approved by the FDA to go into the clinic. They've done clinical studies to show safety, and that through this virus, they can show that ApoE2 is being produced in the spinal fluid. The company recently did an IPO, went public, and we're really looking forward to the next phase of this research, which would be a phase 2 study to show that this viral approach to gene therapy will actually prove effective in slowing down the disease in people that are ApoE4.
Fascinating. Good gene in, bad gene out. I know it's more complicated than that. Howard, here's one interesting one that you hear this phrase come up a lot in Alzheimer's. So what is the blood-brain barrier, and is this an obstacle to the delivery of new drugs?
So think of the brain like a computer, okay, or even like your typing, your keyboard. Mm-hmm. You're drinking coffee one day and you spill coffee on your keyboard.
Not good.
Not good. Your brain is a neurochemical electrical system, and the blood is a mess of hundreds and hundreds of proteins that really would completely mess up this neurochemical electrical system if they got in there in inappropriate amounts. So the blood-brain barrier evolved to protect the brain from what's going on in the blood, basically, and only to allow nutrients and oxygen and other essential factors into the brain that are required for normal brain function. As we age, the blood-brain barrier can break down a bit, and in Alzheimer's, because there's amyloid deposition in the blood vessels, the blood-brain barrier breaks down. And we do think, and I think there's increasing acceptance of this, that part of the disease process is the breakdown in this barrier of the blood, what's called the blood-brain barrier. But we haven't been able to develop a really good therapeutic approach to protecting the blood-brain barrier.
Mm-hmm.
We're invested in a company out in California called Therini that actually has a very novel approach to trying to protect the blood-brain barrier through using monoclonal antibodies to a very specific part of a molecule called fibrinogen that's involved in opening up, in causing inflammation in the blood vessels and opening up the blood-brain barrier by blocking that interaction that this component of fibrinogen has with beta amyloid in the blood vessels to cause the inflammation. So we're just starting to see practical approaches to trying to protect the blood-brain barrier or trying to fix it when it's broken. And I will say finally that one of the things that does affect the blood-brain and the blood vessels in the brain is diabetes and clearly hypertension. And so one of the most important things people can do to protect their brain if they have hypertension is to absolutely make sure, and this has been shown in very large clinical studies, to make sure you manage your hypertension well, because hypertension really is a risk factor to cognitive decline in old age and as a risk factor for dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Got it. All about protecting the keyboard right there, Howard. So,
Yep.
all good. Here's a question that gets us back to the blood test. You mentioned the C2N blood test. How is the test being used, and what other blood tests are on the market or in development?
Well, it's really early days, so I don't think I haven't seen a lot of data from actual clinical practice. Most of the data has come from the use of these tests in clinical trials for enrollment and for monitoring. And there's many, many other tests for inflammation and so on in the pipeline. So I don't think we have, other than sort of guidelines on how to use the test and some controversy about some of the tests, because there are different tests out there. There's something called p-tau 181, p-tau 217, p-tau 231. These are all different tests that measure tau, which is a neuronal protein involved in the wiring of the brain, and also predicts amyloid deposition in the brain. So I haven't quite seen, but I do believe that in the next year or so, you're going to see widespread uptake of these blood tests. So come back in a year. Let's do it in 6 months to a year or 2 years. Let's see what the data look like. But I think there's going to be a big uptake of these tests. I mean, people with cognitive impairment deserve a definitive diagnosis. And the only way they're going to get entree to the new monoclonal antibodies is by having a positive test. And I think as these tests become marketed and widely distributed, I think you're going to see very wide uptake. It's going to be, as I said before, it's going to be a revolution in the way we diagnose and care for people with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Let's get back to therapies. We have new anti-amyloid therapies on the market. How will these drugs impact future clinical trials, and will we start to see combination therapy trials in the next few years?
So right now, I mean, earlier in this week, I attended through Zoom a conference at the National Institute on Aging about combination trials. The ADDF is holding an advisory board in several weeks on what this landscape is going to look like and how we're going to address it. And there are other boards that are, advisory boards and presentations on this pressing issue of combination trials. And there's a number of challenges here. One is that if right now the standard of care are cholinesterase inhibitors like Aricept and Episil, and drugs like that improve memory. So actually most trials today are usually done on a background of the current drugs that are modestly effective to treat the symptoms. But as these monoclonals roll out, they're very expensive. They're burdensome in terms of having to require an infusion, and yet the expectation is that a lot of people will be on these drugs. So the question is, how do we enroll in the new trials if there's sort of almost an ethical obligation to make the new drugs that are disease modifying available to people, well, we have to conduct clinical trials where people are on a background of these monoclonal infusion products, and then we add an anti-inflammatory drug to that. Or will we be able to test the anti-inflammatory drug the way we did in the old days and at present, which is just the anti-inflammatory drug against the placebo? And so this is just the tip of the iceberg, what I've described there. We may have all of the above. There may be trials that are more expensive and more complicated that require 4 arms instead of just 2, placebo and treatment. Now you need placebo, you need treatment with a monoclonal, you need treatment with your new anti-inflammatory, and then you need treatment with the combination of your anti-inflammatory and the monoclonal. So now we have 4 arms, more expensive, perhaps greater number of people have to be enrolled. And maybe that may be the way to get the answer of what the next landscape is going to look like for treatment. If you think about cancer, how it evolved, most people with cancer are on 3, 4, 5 drugs now at the same time, because you got to get the cancer cell, and you got to really make sure you kill it. And there's so many pathways that the cancer cell can evolve to get around the way we treat them. And I think ultimately, I think with the biomarkers that we have, we'll find those people that have amyloid in their brain and have inflammation, and we'll treat them according to their biomarkers. And people will end up on 2, 3, 4 drugs at a time, just like other diseases of aging. Diabetics tend to be on multiple drugs. Hypertensives have to be on multiple drugs, very often 2 or 3 drugs. Cancer, obviously, and I think Alzheimer's is going in the same direction.
So Howard, we have time for, I'm being told one more, but I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. It's one, because there's just a very practical one here. The connection between sleep and Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So sleep has been shown to be a risk factor, or bad sleep, I should say, for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline, cognitive impairment. I mean, any one of us who's gotten jet lag or had an upsetting evening and didn't sleep all night, or has been depressed and doesn't sleep well, we all know we don't think clearly the next day. We just don't think clearly the next day. It's an immediate effect. Imagine if somebody has a sleep disorder, which is very common, sleep apnea, for example. Part of the evaluation, it's a risk factor. People with sleep apnea have all the complications of lack of sleep, plus they're not getting good oxygen to their brain. So that's a real big one that should be evaluated. In the doctor's questionnaire about a person with memory loss, there should be a question for the partner of that person, the spouse. Does your husband snore? Because you want to get a sleep evaluation for that person. We've learned a little bit about the biology of sleep and why it might be a risk factor. And it turns out that one of the main things that's emerged to try to explain this phenomenon is it's not just neurochemical, but during sleep is the time when the brain cleanses itself of misfolded proteins like beta amyloid and like tau, these main ones. These are 2 examples of misfolded proteins that have become toxic and accumulate. During sleep, we normally are able to remove or get rid of these proteins, these abnormal proteins from the brain. But if you don't get adequate sleep, you're doing that less efficiency. So it might also be that in addition to the immediate effects of sleep on your next day, that long-term having a sleep disorder might also contribute to the disease process. And during a sleep evaluation, we can also analyze their sleep patterns. And some people have what's called a REM sleep disorder, which is the deepest stage of sleep. And those people are at greater risk for a type of dementia called Lewy body dementia, which we haven't talked about at all, but is another common form of dementia that needs to be addressed. And people with sleep disorder should get a sleep evaluation to see if they have REM sleep disorder, which is usually a flailing at night and acting out dreams that's abnormal during certain stages of sleep.
Good. All right, Howard. This may be the penultimate question. It's a great question to end with. So, I've heard this posed to you in many different ways. What is your opinion on screening for Alzheimer's? Should everyone at a certain age be tested, or only when someone starts to experience some kind of cognitive or memory problem?
I've been involved in this one for I don't know how long, 20 years, 30 years. And it really made me angry because there's an organization called the U.S. Preventive Health Services Task Force or something like that. And what they do is they're the body that evaluates these preventative, they'll be the ones to say, should we be screening for hypertension? And they'll review the evidence and then they'll come out with a recommendation. And an A recommendation would be yes, and a B would be maybe, and a C would be we have insufficient information. And they've always given screening for cognitive impairment a C recommendation, which meant that basically screening for cognitive impairment has never really been implemented in the United States. Mm-hmm. Part of the reasoning was that if you had cognitive impairment and you screened for it, or let's say you screened for cognitive impairment and you found it, why bother? There's nothing you can do. This was their reasoning. It was mainly focused over the fact there were no drugs. And I suppose 20 years ago, we didn't know a whole lot about prevention. I always felt that we should be screening because if people had undiagnosed early cognitive impairment, they should be tested, they should be diagnosed, and they should be cared for. Mm-hmm. We still don't have a change in their rating. So this major organization is still recommending, as far as I know, a C recommendation. But now that we have drugs, we can put screening for cognitive impairment into the mainstream of screening for and prevention, because as I said, this organization, and just as an exemplar, has always said, there's nothing you can do. Well, now there's something you can do. You can prescribe the new drugs, and we know that precision prevention works. Yeah. So I hope that this organization and all other organizations that are involved in widespread prevention programs, will now embrace screening so that we can get early detection, so we can get people into prevention programs, so we can get people on these new and effective drugs so that we can reduce the burden of caring for people with Alzheimer's disease. And I hope that'll happen either through that task force or through other mechanisms that will enable doctors to actually do screening. We do have new codes for cognitive testing and for care management that Medicare has come out with that kind of enables screening in a way through practice. But I think we have more work to do to get screening into the mainstream of clinical practice. And there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had around that issue.
Howard, and listening to all this today, because we've talked about therapies, we've talked about diagnostic, biomarkers, prevention, precision prevention. You can see a world whereby, just like we do with heart disease, and screen really early in people's adult lives of what's coming, that the same will be done for your brain health and cognitive health, which is great. Howard, you've been nothing short of brilliant today. And I just want to say to everybody, because we still have more questions in the queue, what we always do is we take the ones we haven't answered, we get with Howard, we'll get you direct answers to those questions. Howard, like I said, we had a big group on today, and a lot from the scientific community, and we say to them, hats off. This is harvest time, as you like to say. Our donors are on, and I hope our donors feel like, boy, the revenue or the fuel, the capital they're putting to ADDF, 100% of it goes straight out to these clinical trials. So we're very grateful there. And Howard, I know one thing, we are incredibly grateful for you and the scientific team at ADDF. So thank you for the time, Howard, today.
Well, thanks for having us and allowing us to tell the story. Really appreciate it.
You got it. Take care, everybody.